This is Big Podcast.
There's a joke in the entertainment industry, and you've probably noticed this yourself. If you think about The Rock, or you think about Kevin Hart, you think about AC/DC, you think about certain characters that you see in movies or TV, book authors. Yeah, they've had a lot of books or albums or movies, but it's the same thing every single time, just a little bit different, maybe a different title. In some ways, it's same story, different characters. We get into that as podcasters. I'm talking about that today on this episode. It's Build a Big Podcast, a marketing podcast for podcasters. This is the podcast for you if you want to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make people care about your podcast, and make money with your podcast. You can find me at bigpodcast.com. I'm doing this in a different way based on what I'm talking about today, which is ruts, apathy, rejuvenating your podcast. Normally, and I'm sticking with this, I'm going to die on this hill. I love Audacity. It is a free tool, the number one DAW, digital audio workstation in the world, as far as the number of people that it reaches. Hundreds of thousands of people download it every single month. I love Audacity. This episode being recorded on Adobe Audition, just to change things up, because I'm talking about ruts, and I'm talking about what can we do to change things up when we're in a rut. Well, change your location, change the DAW that you're using. You will approach things differently when you are in a different space. So for this episode, I'm using a Shure SM58 mic. Normally I use an RE20 by Electro Voice. I'm using the Vocaster 1 interface. Normally I use a Vocaster 4i4 interface. I'm in my office. It's got no soundproofing, just a lot of stuff. So you might hear a little bit of a difference. Those are the changes that I made up. And I want to continue on what I talked about on the last episode, which is apathy, getting into ruts, rejuvenating your podcast. We all get into these. And after so many years, I'm 600 and something episodes in. That's just to this podcast. I've done thousands of podcasts. That's not an exaggeration. We can do the same podcast every time. You kind of know where things are headed. So let's talk about the things that you can do if you are facing apathy, maybe bored of podcasting, a little bit tired, you want to rejuvenate things. Let's do that. I got 10 things here. We're going to go through them. First thing, personal connection. You need to know who you are talking to, and that is not an avatar. I know there are a lot of people that talk about this. Have an avatar, know who your ideal customer is, your ideal listener. That's a nice starting point to think, yes, I'd like this type of person to listen to my podcast. But I think it really changes things when you have a personal connection with your audience. And we're going to get into how to do that, because I think this is the foundation of what I'm talking about. When you know who you're speaking to, it has you show up in a different way. Knowing that somebody is on the other side of what you're recording. Right now, I'm in my office. As I mentioned, it's a little bit different than the 5x8 closet that I normally use. I'm sitting here alone. I've got all my stuff around me. I don't know if somebody's going to listen to this or not. You are listening, so thank you for completing that cycle. But we don't know. And it's easy for us to think about these avatars, these nameless, faceless downloads that we're getting. This concept of a person, not really thinking that these are people. So let's talk about what are some effective ways that you found to engage with listeners on a personal level. The thing that I like to do before I'm doing a book, before I'm doing a new podcast, or sometimes just during the year, if I'm feeling I'm in a rut, I'll take some calls. I'll do a group call. That can be effective. The one-on-one call to me is even more effective though. And I'm talking about a call like a phone or a Zoom session. It could be even sitting down with somebody and saying, what is it that you need to know about blank, the topic of your podcast, and really listening to them on a personal level about why they would want to know that. For example, if somebody's doing a podcast, my avatar might be, they want to build a business with a podcast. They want to make money. They want to have financial freedom. They want time freedom. But it could be maybe they just want to get a message out. And if so, what is that message? That's why you want to have this personal connection, not just this nameless, faceless business school avatar example of something that doesn't exist or exist only in your head. Yeah, you can throw that stuff out there and try to attract people like that. But I think it's really important to talk to people, because the people that are listening to you or that you're attracting, those are the people that you're doing something right for now. Dance with the one that brung you, as they say. Dive deeper into that. Find what they like about you, and you can change it any way you want, but just know why people are listening now. So that's number one, personal connections. Number two, engagement methods. direct interaction with listeners, one-on-one calls like I'm talking about, those have been the most effective for me. Group experiences are great. Meetups are great. If you travel, and I used to do this all the time, especially when I was in the music industry where I was traveling a lot, I would set up these meetups. Say I'm in Philadelphia. Hey, we're doing a meetup. Here's the coffee shop. If you're in Philly and you're listening to me, come on out. I'm going to be there. You get 2 or 3 people from Philly, maybe 5 or 6, maybe a dozen or 2. Depends on who your audience is and how big they are. But getting engaged with them, finding out about their scene, that adds to that personal connection. But it also gets you really clear on what you're doing. And you've got to ask for those things. People are not necessarily going to come to you. A lot of people are intimidated by you. You're this voice in their ears and they don't think of you as a real person. Well, you are a real person. So get out there, talk to these people, also real people. They understand you're real. You understand that they're real. And you're going to have a better podcast because of it. Number 3 is a content refresh. Experiment with different formats, different topics. That's going to keep your content fresh. A drastic change for most people would be to go from interviews to monologue. I did interviews for a number of years, at least 10, maybe 12, before I stepped into monologue stuff. It's weird. It's weird for me right now to sit here in my office and talk in this microphone with nobody listening to me, maybe people outside this room. And I've been doing this for a long time. I've done hundreds of these monologue episodes. Like I said, this podcast, 669 maybe, I don't know what the episode number is, but in the 600s, most of them monologues. If you're doing monologues, change that up. Do interviews. If you're doing interviews, change that up. One of the things you can do, by the way, if you're looking to change things up and you're not ready to go full on monologue, if you're doing interviews, bring in a co-host. You can bring in recurring co-host. For example, if you've got a weekly podcast, first week of the month, it's always Jim. Second week of the month, it's always Mary. Third week of the month, it's Jane. Bring in these recurring cast of characters that your audience will get to know, that gets to know you in your format, and you get to know so you can play off of them. That's a great way to refresh things. And if you're only doing it, let's say once a month, you're rotating out 4 or 5 people, well, that'll keep things pretty fresh. Here's what that would look like. I do the weekly show. That's the audio edition of my newsletter, Big Podcast Insider. I've got 5 or 10 things that I'm covering. I could cover those and discuss them with Mary, discuss them with Jim. Or maybe I bring in 3 of those things. I tell Mary and Jim, hey, bring in 3 elements from this week related to this topic. I'll discuss those with you. That's going to keep things fresh. Don't just have you driving the thing, even though you are driving the thing. Allow them to bring their creative elements in, not just play off you, unless they're really great at playing off you. Your podcast, you can do whatever you want. But I'm saying there are multiple ways to have a content refresh. It's not necessarily content refreshing. It's the way you approach that content. Let's talk about some burnout solutions. Number 4, what do you do to combat burnout and apathy in your podcasting journey? I do find that talking to people is good. The things that I'm talking about here, personal connection, working on engaging people, bringing in new people, everything that we're talking about can be an opportunity to help with burnout. However, if that's not working for you, sometimes you got to take time off. We're coming up on a few holidays here. Take time off. Nobody is going to fault you for taking a break. Your listeners love what you do, and they want you to continue to do what you do. So if you need to take a week off, maybe a month off, as long as you let people know, they will stick it out with you. Now, with that said, when you're going into a holiday, which again, we are now, we've got several holidays coming up. Maybe that's the time for you to experiment with something different. That's what I'm doing right now. It's a holiday. I'm like, yeah, kind of in a different mindset. Listeners are in a different mindset. Maybe I'll switch up the equipment, switch up the place that I'm doing my podcast. You can step off the gas, let off the gas, maybe even pump the brakes. From my experience, any of those things will work for burnout. Number 5, let's talk about community building. It is important to build a community around your podcast and the content in which you create. I got a co-host here. This is what happens when you do it in your office. My dog just busted in the door. Open the door. I don't know how he did it. He doesn't have thumbs. And now he's gone. So the door is open. It's changing this. But speaking of community, the dog community. Let's talk about building a community around your podcast. If you're traveling, oh, what is this? Now you're in here? Oh, okay. You want to be on the podcast? No. All right. Now my wife came in. This is why I've got a studio, by the way. This is the real life podcast, though. She shakes her head. No, I don't want to be on this podcast. Side note, this is one of the things that we did when we were burnt out. You may remember this podcast if you've been following me for a long time. I had a podcast that was co-hosted with my wife, and we did, I don't know, a couple hundred episodes maybe, called Red. It started out as real entrepreneur development, and it ended up being reach, expand, and develop your audience, because I wanted to keep the name and I needed it to stand for something else, because neither of us were really happy with real entrepreneur development. It started literally over dinner, and by that night, yeah, we were in. We had what we thought was a pretty good idea, and it was a good idea. It did really well. But it was one of those things like you get into it and like, well, it's not what we thought it was, because the inside is always different from the outside. She wanted to do something different because she was experiencing her own level of burnout or needing a content refresh. I wanted to do something different. So we were having to compromise, and we ended up going our separate ways. Not in a relationship way, but just in a podcasting way. And that was fine. So I thought on that. And also, that's why I've got my own studio, the tricked out closet. You actually go in a room, the door is closed, and then there's a tricked out closet inside that room full of padding. I wouldn't hear somebody, even if they were in the room outside of that closet, but it's a whole lot more private than this. Something to think about. Maybe you want that privacy for your podcast, or maybe you like somebody hearing you. I don't know what that would be like. I broadcast out of a radio station for the show that I do called Music Business Radio. And it is, as you would expect, a typical radio studio where there's glass and you can look in, you can see us recording. I guess it's cool. Everybody in the station, they know how to act when you're recording. The on-air light is on, but there is something neat about having a live audience, and sometimes actually even having people in the studio with you that are there viewing you, listening to you, participating somewhat, but really more as observers. Sometimes a live audience is fun, and that's another way to change up your content. But anyway, let's get back to community building. I think the thing that can help with your community, not necessarily just broadcasting in front of people, but going out and talking to people, having these experiences with them where you're just listening, really, finding out why they like the podcast, because why they're listening to the podcast and what they like about it is often completely different from what you think. Let's talk about feedback. Number 6, how do you collect feedback and implement listener feedback? I think you've got to be careful who you take feedback from, because everybody's going to have an opinion about your podcast. For example, let's go back to the monologue versus co-host thing. People might say, oh man, I wish you'd do more monologues. Well, I don't like doing monologues. I can't do monologues. Monologues take too much time. I'm too nervous to do a monologue. Well, you're not going to listen to that feedback, and you don't need to force yourself into something that you don't want to do because somebody thinks, oh, I want a monologue. Well, if you want a monologue, go somewhere else, because I'm not doing a monologue. Or if you want interviews, go somewhere else. I'm not doing interviews. So when it comes to feedback utilization, do be careful who you're getting feedback from. But also, if you're starting to hear patterns, I think it's important to acknowledge those, not just say, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, maybe he does know what he's talking about. Maybe it's not your show, but it is something to be aware of. Let's go back to the monologue versus interview thing. A lot of people want interviews, maybe. All right, well, maybe this isn't the show for you, but people want that. Maybe it's a different show that you could create. Or maybe there's someplace that you could refer people to. I think it's important to look for patterns. I don't think you need to change it like the wind blows. Oh, let's do this. Oh, no, let's take that away. Oh, this is popular. Don't do that. That's going to drive you crazy. But yeah, feedback utilization. And how do you get feedback? The best way, sitting down with people, surveys. Tom Webster, in his book called The Audience is Listening, he talks about getting feedback and listener surveys. Tom comes from a radio background. I've been in that world as well. He reminds me of a lot of the consultants that come through the station. I see in both ways that you've got jocks, and in your case, being a host, where you know what it is that you do and what you want to do, and you don't really want to change. And you've got consultants that aren't attached to it. Well, we've got to listen to what the listeners want. They're just going for views or listens. Maybe that's something to think about. He's definitely got some good questions that you can ask yourself and ask others about making your podcast and your broadcasting better. As far as how to get it, yeah, in person, email, take it any which way that you can. But do look at who you're getting feedback from, because not all feedback is equal. Talk about multi-way engagement. That's number 7. Don't just air your episodes, meaning that you get behind a mic and you talk to people. I like a multi-engagement. I like hitting listeners through as many senses and as many ways as possible. And that could be the live events that we're talking about. That could be social media. I really like visual things like memes, graphics. Maybe it's video. It doesn't have to be all of them. I'm not a video guy. Sometimes I'll release a video, but very, very rarely, and usually not with me in it. If you want an example of this, there's some trailers for the books that I've done. You can see that on the Big Podcast Instagram page. That's going to hit people in a different way. They're voiced not by me, but by other people. Some of them are voiced by me. But I think hitting people in different ways, the more senses that you can touch, and this is the reason that you want to have these live events, because you're going to touch all senses. People can touch, they can smell, they can see, they can hear, they can feel. There's an energy when people get together. But yeah, multi-way engagement, that's good. You're not just an audio only person. With that said, there's this whole be everywhere thing, and do all of it. Don't get on the content treadmill. Let's take it back to video. People think, oh, man, YouTube's hot. I got to do video. No, you don't. No, you don't. If you're an audio person, do audio, but do it great. Do it great. Even if you look at the Podcasting Hall of Fame, the way they pick people for that, yeah, you can be popular, but you can also do one thing and do it really well. And your podcast is the same way. Number 8, learning from experience. I think it's great for you to jump in. I think it's great for you to try things. I think it's great for you to look at formats. I think it's great for you to look at content. I think it's great for you to tell jokes or push the edge, assuming that that's what you want to do. It's great for you to play it safe, assuming that's what you want to do. But learn from those experiences. If you're not getting the listeners you want, maybe it's not the algorithm, maybe it's you. Because I just can't get the traffic I need anymore. Maybe it's you. Maybe tastes have changed. I certainly had to look at this myself. And I'm talking about as somebody who's been online and marketing online full-time, 25 years. The first 5 years, I was doing some other things. So let's say 30 years. Like, man, it's just not as easy as it used to be. Yeah, because video is getting better. Audio is getting better. The bar at which we have to work is getting higher. We could say, oh, the algorithms changed. Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe tastes have changed. Maybe the competition is getting better. And the bar to entry, I'm talking into a $99 mic. And the Vocaster 1, I just saw this interface that I'm using right now, $59. So under $200, you've got a pretty good setup. And this is no effects that I'm going into right now. I mean, I'm going to edit a little bit. I'm going to touch it up in Adobe Audition because I'm working on Adobe Audition right now. Just trying to get a feel for that because so many projects come my way where they're in Adobe Audition. It's important for me to know it. And that's why I'm testing it here. But regardless, the point is you try things. Some of them work, some of them don't work. The stuff that works, if it works for you, continue with it. The stuff that doesn't work, either for other people or for you, maybe think about dropping that. Number 9, as far as a refresh, I've talked a little bit about this, monologue versus co-host. I have thought about adding guest co-hosts to this primarily monologue podcast. I talked a minute ago about what that would look like. What that looks like is the weekly newsletter. I bring in somebody else to discuss those elements with. So if we're talking about Spotify doing something, I can banter back and forth on that. Apple adds something. We can talk about that new feature with a banter back and forth rather than me just blah, 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 monologuing about it. It's easier for people to listen to. You don't have to think as hard as you do with a monologue. It's more conversational. You can kind of check out, you can drive, you can work. Again, an easier listen. That's a great way for you to change things up for you and your listeners. Because here's the reality. If you're getting bored and you're phoning it in, your listeners are probably getting bored. And you can look at the numbers. Again, we can blame the algorithm all we want. Oh, there's no discovery. The algorithm changed. Yeah, or maybe your stuff is boring. It's just not hitting like it was. Or maybe people have heard the same thing like I talked about at the very beginning of this. That AC/DC album again, that Kevin Hart movie again, they just don't need another one. I heard John Cougar Mellencamp say this, and I think this is accurate. He said, everybody likes Jack and Diane. They don't really want to hear the new stuff. So I got to be comfortable with that. I go out there and maybe throw in a new song or two, but Jack and Diane, that's why they're there. That's the best stuff I've got. Consider that. I'm going to leave you this. This is number 10, listener challenges. I talked about the 30-day solo podcast challenge. Speaking of monologues, if you want to get better, this is an opportunity for you, the 30-day solo podcast challenge. You can find out more about this at bigpodcast.com. Basically, here's how it works. And I want you to think about this as I'm talking about it, because you could do something similar for your podcast. A lot of people come to me and they say, how can I do a monologue podcast? And the reason they do that is because they're interviewing people. That is more or less how podcasts start. It's easier for us to have a conversation with somebody because we're so used to doing it than it is for us to monologue. So hearing that, being aware of that, having been through my own experience with monologues, as I mentioned, 10, 12 years before I did one of them, I thought, let me put together a training, things that have helped me from all these experiments that I've been doing. Let's speed this up for people. If you want to do it, sit down for 30 days. At the end of 30 days, you're going to be a better monologuer, a better solo podcaster. And that's what that looks like. You have that element for your podcast, and what it's going to bring about. We talk about personal connection, not just with you, with listeners, with each other. They can learn from each other. They can connect with each other. They can know they're in the same position or in a similar position as each other. It brings about the engagement, the interactivity. It better establishes a relationship with you as an authority, but also as somebody who's on their side. And it makes things interactive. That's a whole lot better than just watching. Watching, it's got its place. Like watching sports. Yeah, it's great to sit there and watch sports. Great. But a lot of people want to participate. Who are you for? If you really want an engaged audience, you want the participants, the guys that are jumping in. That's where a listener challenge comes in. The 30-day solo podcast challenge, as the name would imply, 30 days, maybe a little bit too long. I'd say most people got about 10 days in them, maybe even 5 days. Something they can really go for a few days, walk out, feel a little bit better about things than when they came in. A quick win, if you will. 30 days, that's a commitment. It's like a technical school versus a 4-year college. 4 years, I don't know about 4 years. That seems like a big commitment. But technical college, 3 months to a new career, okay, I can do that. So think about that. I do think if you do one of these things, even if you start it as just a weekend program, that is one of the things that can re-energize you, bring people over to your podcast, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about you getting re-energized, your audience getting re-energized, you having the impact that I talked about at the beginning, a podcast that people care about. Well, this is one way to do it, a listener challenge. I'd love to discuss these topics more with you. If you are interested, feel free to reach out to me via Blue Sky. My name on there, David Hooper, DavidHooper, or you can search for bigpodcast.com on Blue Sky. They're twice. Happy to answer any questions. I'm going to be doing some more of these lo-fi podcasts. Over the break, I'm working with some different tools. Like I said, different projects come into me. People utilize different tools. Audition is one of those. Will I ever stop using Audacity? I doubt it. The new Audacity 4.0, that is coming very soon. It is a good program. And think about how much money you'll save. If I were to pay the monthly fee, and this is billed annually, the month-to-month is about $36 on Audition. But if you pay annually, I think you get it for $23. Look at those numbers. Let's say $250 a year, up to $350, $400 a year. Think about the years I've been podcasting using free software. What's an extra $250 to $400 a year going to do you? Well, it would buy this kit that I'm talking into. This is a $99 mic, $59 interface. Again, if you got thoughts, Blue Sky is the social media network of choice. You can also find me at bigpodcast.com. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast. That way you'll never miss an episode. So go there right now before you forget, bigpodcast.com. And I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.